Have you ever heard of a king who had 700 wives and 300 concubines? It sounds almost unbelievable. But this story is recorded in the very pages of the Bible. A man so wise that he was able to judge his people with justice, build a majestic temple for God, and write proverbs that have lasted for centuries. But who was also known for his excesses, passions, and choices that changed the destiny of an entire nation. This man was Solomon, the wisest king and at the same time one of the most enigmatic figures in all biblical history. Today you will enter his palace. You will walk among golden columns, smell the fragrance of the hanging gardens, hear the whisper of hundreds of female voices that made up the greatest harem of antiquity. But above all, you will come to know the man behind the crown, his virtues, his flaws, and the secrets that are not always told in the common readings of the scriptures. Before we begin this journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the notification bell. That way you won't miss any of the upcoming Bible stories for sleep that we have carefully prepared for you. Now I invite you to lie down comfortably, close your eyes, and take a deep breath. This is your moment of rest. As your mind relaxes, let this narrative gently carry you into the story, as if you were truly walking alongside King Solomon in his magnificent court. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Jerusalem on a quiet night. Torches discreetly illuminate the city walls, and the gentle breeze blowing from the hills of Judah carries with it the aroma of olive trees. The distant sound of psalms echoes from some synagogue, while the heart of the people beats with expectation. Who will be the next king of Israel? David, the great warrior, the psalmist poet, the man after God's own heart, is old. His hair no longer has the same strength. His voice, once firm on the battlefield, is now soft and fragile, but his eyes still carry the memory of victories and defeats, of desert escapes, of glorious conquests, and of a reign that transformed a nation. He who faced Goliath, who fled from Saul, who conquered Jerusalem and made it the capital, now approaches the end of his life. In the palace, the silence is heavy with tension. Sons secretly dispute who will inherit the throne. Some believe that Adonijah, the oldest living son, should naturally assume the crown. Others whisper the name of Solomon, the son David had with Bathsheba, the one who was born from a story marked by pain, sin, and forgiveness. The palace walls guard secrets never revealed. The people in the streets only wait, but within the walls family intrigues unravel like invisible threads weaving the destiny of Israel. Imagine the setting: stone corridors lit by oil lamps, servants moving back and forth carrying jars of water and wine, and officials gathered in small groups, whispering about who would have the greatest chance of sitting on the throne. It was a decisive moment. The future of the nation was at stake, and the next king would not be just a ruler. He would be the shepherd of millions of souls, the chosen one, to keep alive the covenant made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Meanwhile, David rested on his bed, surrounded by counselors and priests. His body no longer had vigor, but his mind still carried the flame of faith. And it is in this scene that Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, quietly enters the king's chamber. She bows before him and reminds him of the promise made. Solomon would be the successor. The prophet Nathan, attentive to the movements, also approaches the royal bed. He knows that God's will must prevail over human disputes. Thus, in a solemn decision, David orders that his son Solomon be anointed king of Israel. Visualize the scene. Solomon, still young, is taken to the Gihon spring. The priest Zadok takes the sacred oil and pours it over his head. The horn of oil flows slowly, and the crowd begins to shout, "Long live King Solomon!" The sound of trumpets echoes through the streets, drums resound, and the entire city rejoices. People run through the squares, repeating in unison the name of the new king. For Solomon, it was the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. Until then, he was just one son among many. But now, suddenly, he bore upon his shoulders the weight of a kingdom, and the destiny of a divine promise. That night, the young king returned to the palace. His heart, though strong, must have beat with anxiety. How to govern such a numerous people? How to keep peace among neighboring nations always in conflict? How to honor the name of his father David, and above all remain faithful to the God who had chosen him? In the distance, the city lights went out one by one. The people, weary from so much expectation, slept with renewed hope. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere was different. Guards took turns at the doors, priests withdrew in prayer, and young Solomon, sitting in silence, contemplated the starry sky of Jerusalem. Imagine him looking at the firmament, remembering the stories told by his father. David spoke to him about the nights in the field, tending the sheep, when he looked at the sky and felt the presence of God so close. Perhaps at that moment, Solomon felt the same, a mixture of fear, responsibility, and reverence. The palace corridors were silent, but in the mind of the new king, thoughts roared like thunder. He knew that human wisdom would not be enough to govern. He needed something greater, something divine. And so the story of the wisest king who ever lived began, not with battles, not with military conquests, but with a silent call to greatness. Solomon, the heir of a throne marked by blood and poetry, would begin a reign that would be etched not only in the memory of Israel, but in all of human history. The first weeks of Solomon's reign were marked by celebrations, reaffirmed alliances, and the constant movement of the court. Foreign delegations came and went, bringing gifts and closely observing every decision of the new king. The throne was consolidated, but the responsibility weighed upon his shoulders. He was young, and before him stretched a numerous people, with diverse tribes, each with its own traditions, interests, and ancient tensions. It was necessary to govern not only with authority but with discernment. In those days, Solomon's heart sought a higher direction. He remembered the words of his father David, who on his deathbed had told him to remain faithful to the commandments of the Lord, to keep the statutes, and to walk in the ways of God. The old king had been both warrior and poet, and in every victory and fall he had learned that human power meant nothing if it was not submitted to the divine will. Now Solomon, heir of that legacy, felt the need to hear from God himself what would be the source of his strength. Thus, in an act of devotion, the king decided to go to Gibeon, the place where the tabernacle and the great altar stood. The city was a few hours from Jerusalem, and the royal caravan traveled through the hills of Israel until reaching the sanctuary. There, Solomon offered abundant sacrifices. 1,000 burnt offerings were consumed upon the altar, and the smoke rose to the heavens in thick columns, like a cry that could not be ignored. The people watched with reverence, and the priests attended to the rites, but in the king's heart there was more than protocol. There was a silent supplication, a sincere search for guidance. That night, when the camp rested and the fires burned low under the starry sky, Solomon fell asleep. The silence of Gibeon was deep, and in the midst of this rest came the encounter that would change his life. In a dream, the presence of God appeared to him, not as a vague figure, but as a clear, penetrating voice that enveloped everything. And that voice asked him, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Before such a question, any ordinary man would have asked for longevity, military victories, immeasurable riches, fame among the nations. But Solomon's heart was filled with a sense of responsibility. He knew he did not govern for himself, but for an uncountable people, a chosen people. He felt small, inexperienced, before the greatness of the task. In the dream, he bowed before the voice and answered humbly, "Lord, you have shown great mercy to my father David, and have placed me on his throne. But I am still young and inexperienced, and I do not know how to govern. This people are too numerous to be counted. Therefore give your servant a wise heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" The words rose like a rare perfume. The request was not for personal glory, but for wisdom to serve, not for power or vengeance, but for discernment. The king, even surrounded by riches and acclamations, recognized his fragility before the divine calling. And then the answer came, full of benevolence and promise, because you have asked this and have not asked for longevity, nor riches, nor the death of your enemies, but you have asked for wisdom to discern judgment. Behold, I will do according to your words. I give you a wise and understanding heart, so that before you there was none like you, nor shall any arise after you. And I also give you what you did not ask, for riches and glory, so that among the kings there shall be none like you all your days. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, I will lengthen your days. The dream filled Solomon's heart like a river overflowing. When he awoke, he realized it was not merely a nighttime illusion, but a true revelation. He rose early, returned to Jerusalem, and stood before the Ark of the Covenant. There he offered fellowship offerings and banquets of gratitude, sharing with servants and officials the certainty that God had answered. From that moment on, something changed in the young king. His eyes became more attentive, his ears more careful, his mind deeper. There was in him a serenity that inspired confidence, and his words began to carry a different weight, as if every sentence were measured by an invisible scale. The news of the dream spread, first among the priests, then among the elders, and finally throughout all Israel. The people began to look at Solomon, not only as the successor of David, but as a man especially favored by God. His fame for wisdom, though still at its beginning, already rose like a dawn, heralding a radiant sun. In the days that followed, Solomon meditated on the encounter at Gibeon. He understood that the true strength of a king did not lie in the armies he commanded, nor in the political alliances he forged, but in the ability to discern the right path amid life's complexities. He realized that ruling was more than managing wealth or imposing authority. It was caring for the heart of a people, protecting their identity, preserving their faith, and leading them with justice. The purity of his request also revealed the purity of his heart at that beginning. He did not seek personal advantage, but the wisdom that could guide not only his mind, but his entire being. There was in him a simple devotion, a sincere surrender, that reflected the best days of David. The palace, with its corridors full of voices, now became the setting for more thoughtful decisions. The elders noticed the difference. In every audience, Solomon listened at length, reflected before speaking, and when he spoke, he did so in a way that even the oldest fell silent in respect. What began in Gibeon would soon become evident in all his administration. The wisdom of God was not theory, but living practice that manifested itself in every judgment and in every word. This initial phase of Solomon's reign was marked by great harmony. The young king, aware of his smallness, had found in the encounter with God the source of his confidence. His days would still be long, and many challenges would come, but at that moment the purity of his faith and the freshness of his surrender shaped the beginning of a reign that would be remembered forever. Thus the covenant was consolidated. God had given wisdom, and Solomon had asked for exactly what made it possible to govern with justice. What followed was a story of splendor, but also of contrasts, for amid the glory would arise the temptations that would test that heart which at Gibeon had shown itself so pure and so surrendered to the Lord. The first dawns of Solomon's reign rose over Jerusalem, bringing a sense of order and expectation. The young king had already been anointed, had already received in Gibeon the promise of wisdom, and had already offered sacrifices before the Ark of the Covenant. The people looked at him with curiosity. Would he be able to maintain the peace conquered by David? Would he be able to judge with justice the issues that would arise daily in such a vast kingdom? It did not take long for the first great test to present itself. 2 women were brought into the presence of the king. They were not princesses nor ladies of honor, but prostitutes who lived in the same house. Both had recently given birth. One woman's baby had died during the night, suffocated under the body of the sleeping mother. Upon waking and realizing the tragedy, this woman took the living child from her companion and placed him at her side, leaving the dead body in his place. When the other awoke, she immediately recognized that the dead child was not hers, and that the living one had been stolen. The dispute reached the palace. The two women entered before the throne, the hall full of counselors, officials, and attentive servants. It was an unusual scene. It was not about political alliances or tributes, but about an intimate, delicate, and painful matter. Both women spoke intensely, each one claiming for herself the motherhood of the only living child. Solomon remained silent for a time, observing them. The young king's eyes analyzed not only the words but also the emotion that accompanied them. The hall was heavy with tension. How to decide in a situation without witnesses, where each woman claimed to be the true mother? Any ordinary judge might have been lost in uncertainties. Then Solomon asked for a sword. The request sounded strange to those present. The guards looked at each other, but obeyed, bringing a shining blade to the throne. The king with a firm voice declared, "Cut the living child in two and give half to each." A murmur ran through the hall. The sentence seemed cruel, senseless. But it was only a test. The first woman, the one who had lost her child, agreed coldly, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, divide him." Her voice did not tremble. There was no plea in her eyes. The second, seized with despair and love, cried out, "Ah, my lord, give her the living child, but by no means kill him." At that moment, discernment became evident. Solomon ordered, "Give the living child to the second woman. Do not kill him, she is his mother." The sword was not raised, and the child was given to the true mother. The judgment echoed through all Jerusalem and quickly reached the tribes of Israel. The simple but profound episode showed that in the heart of the young king there was more than intelligence. There was divine wisdom capable of probing hidden feelings, revealing the truth where there seemed to be no way out. Solomon's fame began to spread. The people began to see him as an incorruptible judge, able to penetrate the secrets of the human heart. The decision not only resolved a domestic dispute but established the tone of the entire reign in his throne. There would be justice, even in the most impossible cases. The days in the palace became increasingly intense. Solomon spent long hours listening to cases from all parts of the kingdom. Elders came with disputes over land, merchants quarreled over contracts, families sought solutions for inheritances, neighbors argued over wells and animals. The king, seated on his carved wooden throne, surrounded by scribes who recorded each sentence, listened patiently to every voice. The daily life of the royal tribunal was marked by a solemn cadence. Guards announced the litigants, scribes brought wax tablets, servants offered water and kept silence. The columns of the hall reflected the light of the lamps, and the sound of voices echoed through the high ceiling. At the end of each hearing, Solomon's word resounded as the definitive sentence, and no one dared to contest it, for his reputation was already greater than any doubt. The wisdom received in Gibeon manifested itself in practice. It was not an abstract idea, but a living discernment. The king weighed intentions, observed glances, perceived contradictions. His mind seemed to walk invisible paths, finding solutions where others saw only impasse. And so Israel began to live an unprecedented time of confidence. The people knew they could turn to the throne in search of justice. The tribal leaders respected the young king, for they saw in him the ability to judge without favoritism. The peace that David had conquered with the sword, Solomon now began to consolidate with wisdom. As time went by, the king's tribunal became the very symbol of his government. Mornings were dedicated to judgments. In the afternoons, Solomon met with counselors to deal with tributes, constructions, and alliances. At night the palace corridors filled with music and banquets, but the king's fame did not rest upon wealth, but upon his justice. The episode of the two women became marked as the beginning of this reputation. Every traveler passing through Jerusalem carried the story with him, and soon it reached neighboring nations. Foreign kings heard of a young sovereign endowed with supernatural wisdom. And while his glory grew in the eyes of the world, in Israel flourished the respect for the one who judged with equity. Solomon's throne was not only the center of political power but also the moral balance point of a nation. In his decisions the people saw the hand of God, and this perception consolidated his authority more solidly than armies or riches could guarantee. Thus the young man who had begun his reign with humility in Gibeon now became known as the just king, the wise judge, the ruler capable of bringing peace not only through arms but through a heart instructed by the divine voice. The early years of Solomon's reign marked an era of growing prosperity. The young king, endowed with wisdom and an increasingly solid reputation, began transforming Jerusalem into the living image of his glory. The city, which under David had already become the political and religious center of Israel, now also became the reflection of wealth and refinement that attracted visitors from distant lands. At the heart of this transformation stood the royal palace, built with carefully cut stones, lined with cedar from Lebanon, and adorned with imposing columns. The building dominated the landscape. Its gates were guarded by warriors chosen among the strongest, and its inner chambers sheltered a world of luxury rarely seen in the region. The architecture followed grand patterns. There were halls supported by rows of columns, open courtyards where fountains poured out crystal-clear water, corridors lined with carved panels depicting lions, palm trees, and flowers. The floors, covered with polished stones, reflected the light of the lamps, multiplying the gleam of gold and silver spread across vessels, goblets, and ornaments. Every detail seemed designed not only to impress but to convey the idea that the king's power was above the ordinary. The banquets in the palace were spectacles of their own. Long tables were covered with fine cloths and trays of lamb, fattened oxen, birds seasoned with spices from afar. Various fruits filled bronze bowls, red pomegranates, ripe figs, sweet dates, fresh grapes hanging in abundant clusters. Wine flowed in silver jars, served in delicately crafted goblets. The air was impregnated with the fragrance of incense brought from Arabia, mingled with the aroma of roasted meats and freshly baked bread. While nobles and officials settled in, musicians filled the space with harmonious sounds. Harps resounded in soft notes, flutes carried sweet melodies, tambourines and cymbals marked the rhythm of dances that entertained the guests. Singers intoned ancient songs, and at times entire choirs rose in voices that echoed against the stone walls, creating an almost heavenly atmosphere. Servants moved discreetly through the hall. They wore clean linen tunics with worked leather belts and walked silently, bringing trays, filling goblets, lighting lamps as the night advanced. Every gesture was calculated not to interrupt the spectacle of royalty. The palace was not only a residence but a theater of power, where every foreign visitor felt small before the grandeur of the throne of Israel. The atmosphere was one of absolute power. Solomon, seated on his throne of ivory overlaid with gold, dominated the scene. The throne was raised by steps and adorned with sculptures of lions, symbols of strength and majesty. When the king rose, all fell silent. When he spoke, every word was received as a sentence. His presence, marked by serenity and authority, reinforced the contrast between the simple man who had once asked for wisdom at Gibeon and the monarch who now ruled with firm hands and surrounded by splendor. With wealth and prestige also came alliances, and alliances in antiquity were often sealed with marriages. It was in this context that the formation of the royal harem began. The first great step was the union with the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. This marriage not only brought political prestige but inaugurated the custom of integrating foreign princesses into palace life. The presence of the Egyptian princess brought with it new habits and fragrances. Fine linen fabrics, aromatic cosmetics, and golden ornaments began circulating among the women of the palace. The chambers destined for wives and concubines began to expand. Their inner courtyards were adorned with private gardens where palm trees cast shade over fountains and exotic flowers perfumed the air. In time, other alliances added women from different peoples: Moabites, Sidonians, Ammonites, Edomites. Each wife brought not only her beauty but also her culture, her habits, and often her gods. Solomon's harem, which began modestly, gradually became a small representation of the known world, a mosaic of languages, colors, and customs. Life in the harem followed its own rhythm. Concubines adorned themselves with silver jewelry, bracelets, necklaces of precious stones. Fabrics in vibrant tones covered their bodies, and aromatic oils perfumed their skin. Competition and jealousy were common, but the environment was also marked by music, conversations, and intrigues. The women's palace was in itself a city within the city, with maidservants, eunuchs, and guards responsible for maintaining order. Solomon, engaged in banquets, judgments, and treaties, occasionally visited the women's chambers. Each visit was received as an honor and stirred expectations among the women. Over time, this custom multiplied, and the number of wives and concubines grew impressively, until it reached the legendary figures that would become part of Israel's memory. Meanwhile, daily life in the palace continued to reflect royal grandeur. In the courtyards, artisans worked gold and silver. In the kitchens, ovens baked bread without rest. In the stables, imported horses were trained for parades and for war. The walls protected the complex, but the luxury accumulated within could not be hidden. Foreign visitors left in awe and carried stories of splendor back to their homelands. Thus Solomon's reign took on a new dimension. The man who had asked for wisdom now lived surrounded by unparalleled luxury. The palace was the symbol of his glory, the court the stage of his power, and the harem was beginning to become a sign of alliances and excesses that in the future would bring unexpected consequences. At the heart of Solomon's reign rose the work that would forever mark his name and his memory: the Temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. Since the days of David, there had been a deep desire to build a dwelling worthy of the God of Israel. The warrior king had brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city, establishing Jerusalem as the spiritual center of the nation. But he was not permitted to build the temple, for his hands were stained with the blood of battles. It fell to the Son, the King of Peace, to fulfill this sacred mission. The project required years of preparation. Solomon summoned master builders, carpenters, masons, goldsmiths, and sculptors from all parts of Israel and beyond. He made an alliance with Hiram, king of Tyre, who supplied him with cedar and cypress wood transported in rafts by sea to Joppa and then carried to Jerusalem. Quarries were opened and huge stone blocks cut without iron tools at the building site were fitted together with the precision of craftsmen. The temple rose on Mount Moriah, a place laden with ancestral memory. There Abraham had built an altar to sacrifice Isaac, and there David had raised an altar after a plague, consecrating the place to the Lord. Now, upon this ground of stories and promises, the new building emerged as a sign of the divine presence among the people. The architecture of the temple followed sacred proportions. The sanctuary was divided into the outer court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The walls were lined with cedar wood and overlaid with pure gold. Carved panels represented cherubim, palm trees, and flowers, symbols of life and holiness. The floor was also covered with gold so that the light of the lamps reflected in every direction. Two immense columns called Jashan and Boaz were set up before the entrance as sentinels of the house of God. Inside the holy place housed the altar of incense, the table of the bread of the presence, and the golden lampstand with its 7 branches. In the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space, the Ark of the Covenant would rest. There were kept the tablets of the law given to Moses at Sinai, testimony of the eternal covenant between God and Israel. The ark, covered with gold, had above it cherubim with outstretched wings, forming the mercy seat, the invisible throne of the Lord. 7 years passed before the work was completed. Jerusalem daily watched the workers go up and down the hills, bringing stones, wood, and metals. The sound of songs accompanied the laborers, and the rhythm of construction seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the city. Finally, when all was ready, Solomon summoned the people for the dedication of the temple. It was a grand ceremony. From all the tribes came representatives, priests, Levites, princes, and elders. The Ark of the Covenant was brought in solemn procession from the city of David to the newly built temple. Priests carried the ark on their shoulders, and before it marched musicians playing trumpets, harps, and cymbals. The people followed with voices raised in songs, and clouds of incense mingled with the dust of the streets. When the ark was set in its place in the Holy of Holies, a cloud filled the temple. It was the glory of the Lord, the sign of divine approval. The priests could not stand to minister, for the presence of God filled every space. The people, seeing this, fell prostrate with their faces to the ground, recognizing that the work was not only of stone and gold but of holiness. Then Solomon stood before the altar and pronounced his prayer. He opened his arms to heaven and spoke before the multitude. He asked that the Lord dwell in that house, that he hear the prayers of the people, that he forgive their sins when they repented, that he answer their supplications in times of war, famine, or drought. He also asked that even foreigners who sought the God of Israel might find mercy there. His words echoed through the court, and the whole assembly was filled with reverence. At the end of the prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices prepared. The people bowed in worship, and the ceremony continued with offerings and banquets. So many animals were sacrificed in thanksgiving that no one could count them. The dedication of the temple lasted 7 days of celebration, and the whole city was immersed in joy. The construction of the temple consolidated Solomon's spiritual role. He was not only a wise and just monarch, but also the king chosen to build the house of God. His image as ruler became inseparable from this sacred work. The temple stood as a symbol of his covenant with the Lord, and as testimony to the centrality of Jerusalem in the faith of Israel. In the memory of the people, that moment was engraved as the peak of communion between God and the nation. The gleam of gold, the fragrance of incense, the sound of songs, and the vision of the cloud of glory formed a scene that would be remembered for generations. The temple was not just stone and wood, it was the place of presence, the guarantee that the God of heaven dwelt among men. Thus Solomon, the King of Peace, reached his highest point. The house of the Lord was built, the ark rested within it, and Israel celebrated in unity. In the splendor of that day, it seemed that nothing could break the harmony between God, the King, and the people. After the dedication of the temple and the consolidation of Solomon's spiritual authority, the young king turned to another dimension of his government: international politics. Israel was living in a period of peace, inherited from David's conquests, but that peace needed to be preserved in the face of the great neighboring powers. And in the ancient world, alliances were rarely made only with written treaties or verbal promises. They were sealed with royal blood, in marriages that united families and kingdoms. Among all the alliances Solomon established, the most significant was with Egypt. The land of the Nile was still one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the region. Its pharaohs controlled vast wealth, immense armies, and a millennia-old culture that impressed any foreigner. To be on good terms with Egypt was not only a matter of security, but also of international prestige. Thus it was arranged that Solomon would marry a daughter of Pharaoh. Few details have reached us about this princess, but her presence in Jerusalem became a symbol of power and status. The marriage represented more than a personal union. It was a diplomatic pact that ensured that Israel and Egypt would live in peace. The ceremony must have been marked by unusual pomp. Egyptian caravans crossed the desert, bringing the princess with her retinue of maidservants, eunuchs, jewels, and fine fabrics. Along came gifts worthy of an alliance: gold, silver, horses, war chariots, rare perfumes, and perhaps papyrus scrolls with trade contracts. When she entered Jerusalem, the entire city stopped to see the foreign bride who would now be part of the Israelite court. The princess was installed in specially prepared quarters, adorned with private gardens and ornamental pools, reminiscent of the luxury of her homeland. She brought with her a taste for Egyptian cosmetics, music, and perfumes, which quickly mingled with the palace's customs. Solomon's palace, already rich in cultural diversity, was beginning to transform into a true crossroads of peoples. In ancient culture, marriages between kingdoms had a practical and strategic function. By offering a daughter in marriage, the pharaoh bound his honor to the alliance. If Israel were attacked, Egypt would have an interest in defending it, for the pharaoh's family was now tied to the throne of Jerusalem. For Solomon, it was the opportunity to consolidate the image of a king who not only governed with wisdom but also moved skillfully in the international arena. This practice would be repeated many times throughout his reign. Foreign wives arrived as living symbols of treaties and alliances. Each princess who entered the harem represented a nation that now had blood ties with Israel. Moabites, Edomites, Sidonians, Ammonites, neighboring peoples found in Jerusalem a center of diplomatic agreements sealed by matrimonial union. In the context of the court, these women were treated with respect and luxury, but their value went beyond the private environment. They were signs of power, witnesses that Solomon was able to attract the friendship of powerful kingdoms. The more numerous the alliances became, the greater the sense of political security. Banquets in the palace began to include ambassadors and dignitaries from different regions. Each one saw in Solomon not only the king of a relatively small nation but the sovereign who gathered in his harem representatives of the most diverse cultures. This mosaic of wives and concubines gave the king a prestige that spread beyond the borders of Israel. But these marriages were not only symbols of strength, they were also sources of challenges. Each princess brought with her not only her beauty but also her language, her customs, and often her gods. At first this seemed only a cultural curiosity, an expression of the kingdom's richness and reach. Yet seeds had been planted, seeds that in the future would give rise to spiritual conflicts and the turning of hearts. For now, however, the presence of Pharaoh's daughter was a sign of political victory. Solomon walked through Jerusalem with the confidence of one who knew he had the friendship of one of the greatest powers in the world. The people, seeing the court expand, felt protected and proud. The reports of this alliance traveled quickly and reached distant ears, further increasing the king's fame. Thus Solomon's matrimonial policy took its first steps. The man who had asked for wisdom at Gibeon was now beginning to use diplomacy as a weapon, and each foreign wife who crossed the palace gates was more than a companion. She was the living reflection of the power and diplomacy of the king of Israel. The alliance with Egypt was only the beginning. As the years passed, Solomon's palace became the destination of countless princesses and noble young women from distant lands. Each marriage sealed a political pact, each concubine represented a diplomatic victory, and the king's harem, which had begun as a discreet wing of the palace, was transformed into its own universe, a city within the city. Moabite women were brought from the lands east of the Jordan, adorned in linen dresses dyed in vivid colors, carrying in their baggage small idols and silver amulets. Edomite women arrived with skin marked by the desert sun, bringing strong perfumes extracted from resins and precious stones from the mountains of Seir. Sidonian women, daughters of the land of the Phoenician sailors, came into Jerusalem carrying purple fabrics and ivory ornaments. Hittite women, remembered as warriors of ancient eras, offered their daughters in marriages that sealed peace with a people who had once been enemies. With each arrival, the city of Jerusalem filled with expectation. Caravans passed through the gates, bringing brides and their entourages, accompanied by musicians, servants, and animals, carrying chests overflowing with dowries. The procession made its way to the palace gates, where the new wife was received with rites of honor, perfumes, and banquets. To the eyes of the people, each marriage increased the king's glory. For the scribes it was another page recorded in the annals of the court. For Solomon, it was another piece in the complex political chessboard that maintained peace in the kingdom. The harem, initially small, was transformed into a grand wing of the palace. The chambers were decorated with embroidered curtains, cushions of fabrics from the east, and carpets covering the stone floors. Fountains were built to bring freshness to the environment, and inner gardens cultivated rare flowers, palm trees and fruit trees, that filled the air with gentle aromas. Daily life in the harem was marked by a mixture of luxury, rivalry, and intrigue. Each wife sought to attract the king's attention, and the concubines competed among themselves with looks, gestures, and whispered words. Jealousy was inevitable, and small groups formed according to the women's origins. Moabites united with their country women, Sidonians shared the secrets of their language, Egyptians preserved their rites and cosmetics. This cultural diversity transformed the harem into a Tower of Babel, where perfumes, music, and languages mingled daily. The routine was punctuated by perfumed baths in large stone pools. Maidservants poured aromatic oils into the water, and the rising steam filled the air with the fragrances of myrrh, aloes, and camphor. The women emerged from the waters with glowing skin, then were covered in the finest veils, adorned with silver bracelets, necklaces of precious stones, and delicate tiaras. Musicians moved through the inner courtyards, playing harps and lutes, while dancers performed soft movements to the sound of flutes and tambourines. Nights were marked by private feasts, where some women sang in their native tongues, others recounted stories of their peoples, and some competed in dance displays to enchant not only their companions, but also the attentive eyes of the officials who served the king. Luxury was evident in every detail. Golden trays held dried figs, dates drizzled with honey, pomegranates opened like red jewels. Imported wines flowed in silver goblets, carpets embroidered with golden threads covered the rooms, and bronze lamps kept the night always illuminated. But behind so much splendor, the atmosphere was also one of constant rivalry. Each woman dreamed of being remembered, each hoped to be chosen to spend a night beside the king. The favorites received costly gifts, fine fabrics, rare perfumes. The forgotten sank into bitterness, feeding murmurs and intrigues. The eunuchs and maidservants, responsible for maintaining order, witnessed secrets and conflicts that never reached the ears of the people. For Solomon, the harem represented both pleasure and power. Each wife was a living symbol of alliance. Each concubine reinforced his image as a king who ruled not only territories but also foreign hearts. In the eyes of the world, Solomon's vast harem was a sign of unparalleled prestige and strength. No other king in the region could compare to his abundance of wives, concubines, and riches. The women's palace became a secret city, with its own laws and hierarchies. Some women exercised political influence, serving as bridges between their native peoples and the throne of Israel. Others found in luxury and music consolation for the distance from their homeland. All, however, were part of the grand image of a king whose fame spread further and further across the known world. Thus the royal harem grew, a universe of silks and gold, perfumes and music, laughter and tears, passions and rivalries. A reflection of Solomon's absolute power, but also a seed of future tensions, hidden among columns, veils, and perfumed gardens. In the heart of the Palace of Jerusalem, beyond the cedar-paneled corridors, and the rooms lit by golden lamps, there was a reserved space surrounded by silence, the chambers of the concubines. While the wives, especially those of royal origin, represented political alliances and diplomatic treaties, the concubines had another role in the king's life. They were women chosen for their beauty, youth, or singular charm, and were tied much more to pleasure and intimate companionship than to diplomacy. The difference between wives and concubines was clear. The wives were foreign princesses or women of noble families, given in marriage to seal peace pacts. Each of them brought with her a dowry, servants, customs, and often the responsibility of representing her nation within the palace. The concubines, on the other hand, came from varied origins. Some were gifts sent by foreign rulers, others were young women from Israelite families chosen for their beauty, and there were even those who were bought or received as part of tributes. They did not possess the same status as the wives, but they lived surrounded by luxury, adorned with jewelry, fabrics and perfumes, sustained by Solomon's wealth. The daily life of the concubines was marked by a routine different from that of the official wives. They did not have the same political influence, but they competed among themselves for the king's attention. In their reserved chambers, surrounded by eunuchs and maidservants, they devoted themselves to beauty and refinement. They spent hours in perfumed baths, where waters mixed with oils of myrrh and camphor left their skin soft and radiant. Then they were anointed with fragrances of nard, sandalwood, and roses, and their hair was braided with golden ribbons and small adornments of precious stones. At dusk, when the breeze blew through the inner courtyards, some were called to perform dances before the king. They moved to the sound of lutes, flutes, and soft drums, their veils fluttering, revealing just enough to enchant without fully uncovering. Others displayed their talents in singing or poetry, reciting verses in different languages, inherited from their native lands. For Solomon, these women represented more than simple company. They were symbols of his abundance, living reflections of the glory that God had granted him. To have hundreds of concubines was proof that nothing was lacking to him, that his table was always full, and that his fame as supreme king extended far beyond the borders of Israel. In a world where power was measured by armies, lands, and treasures, Solomon's harem was in itself a declaration of supremacy. Court accounts describe that the concubines were kept in specific wings, separated from the principal wives, but still surrounded by luxury. Embroidered carpets covered the floors, translucent linen curtains softened the light of the lamps, and small inner gardens offered shade and freshness. There, time was spent in conversations, laughter, small rivalries, and endless waiting for the king's visit. The favorites among the concubines received special gifts: gold bracelets, earrings set with sapphires, dresses woven in purple. Those who held Solomon's gaze for longer rose to a privileged position within the harem, and their influence, though limited, could even shape certain minor court decisions. The prestige of being chosen was not confined to the palace. Entire families felt honored knowing their daughter had become a concubine of the king. But there was also the other side of this splendor. Life in the harem was not only made of music and perfumes. Among the concubines reigned a silent tension, marked by jealousy and the uncertainty of the future. Many were never called by the king, remaining forgotten in their chambers. Others were remembered only for a night, never to be seen by him again. The eternal waiting turned luxury into a golden prison, where each woman competed not with weapons or arguments, but with glances, gestures, and silences. Even so, for Solomon, the ensemble of wives and concubines was part of his image as a universal king. He was seen as one who gathered in his palace the most beautiful women of the nations, as if all the cultures of the known world converged in his court. This abundance was not merely a demonstration of pleasure, but above all a sign of power. It was living testimony that no other ruler in the region could compare to him. When foreigners arrived in Jerusalem, they heard not only of the golden throne or the majestic temple, but also of the harem that housed hundreds of women. Solomon's fame spread, and his court became legendary, the king who ruled by wisdom, by wealth, and also by seduction. Thus the concubines, though less remembered in the chronicles, played a fundamental role in the mosaic of the reign. They were the reflection of the secret of pleasure that surrounded Solomon, and also one of the pillars of his image before the world. The man whose abundance had no limits, whose palace was the stage of power, and whose name crossed borders as a symbol of incomparable glory. Among all the remarkable episodes of Solomon's reign, none was as legendary as the visit of the Queen of Sheba. Her arrival in Jerusalem has endured through the centuries as a tale of fascination, luxury, and mystery, symbolizing the moment when the fame of the King of Israel reached the ends of the known world. Sheba was a distant kingdom, located in the lands of southern Arabia, a prosperous region thanks to caravan routes that transported spices, gold, precious stones, and rare incense. Its queen, whose name remains shrouded in silence in the pages of history, ruled with uncommon authority and wealth for a woman of her time. When she heard about Solomon's wisdom, his just judgments, and the splendor of his court, she decided to see with her own eyes if the reports were not exaggerations. The journey was long and majestic. Caravans departed from the south carrying gifts fit for kings: gold in great quantity, precious stones, carefully cut, chests filled with spices and incense. Camels covered in embroidered mantles crossed deserts, accompanied by guards, musicians, and servants. The procession passed through arid plains, hidden oases, mountains, and valleys until it reached Jerusalem. When she finally entered the city, the people crowded the streets to see the visitor. She was a woman of noble bearing, wrapped in veils and silken fabrics, adorned with necklaces of gold and stones that reflected the sunlight. Her eyes, firm and enigmatic, conveyed as much power as curiosity. Beside her, camels carried loads so precious that the very entrance of the procession became an unforgettable spectacle. In the palace, Solomon received her with all honor. The throne hall was adorned for the occasion: gleaming columns, purple carpets, golden vessels overflowing with flowers, lamps spreading soft light. Musicians played melodies while dancers performed solemn movements. The meeting of the two sovereigns brought together not only kingdoms, but also symbols of distant cultures that for a moment converged in Jerusalem. The queen, determined to test the king's fame, presented him with riddles and difficult questions. She tested his wisdom with inquiries about life, nature, governance, and the divine. Solomon, endowed with the gift granted by God, answered them all with serenity and clarity, offering solutions, explanations, and reflections that amazed not only the visitor, but her entire retinue. With each answer, the queen's admiration grew, and her conviction that she stood before an exceptional man became indisputable. She walked through the corridors of the palace, observed the servants dressed in linen, the lavish banquet tables, the ivory and gold-adorned thrones, the guards lined up with gleaming swords. She saw the order, the abundance, and the discipline that reigned in Jerusalem. She contemplated the temple of the Lord, smelled the aroma of the sacrifices, heard the songs of the Levites, and witnessed the devotion of the people. And then she declared, "The report I heard in my land of your acts and of your wisdom was true, but I did not believe the words until I came and saw with my own eyes. And behold, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame I heard." The gifts exchanged between the two sovereigns were worthy of their stature. The queen offered gold in a quantity never before seen in Israel, rare spices whose fragrance filled the halls, and precious stones that shone like stars. In return, Solomon gave her everything she desired, gifts of incalculable value, along with riches and honors that demonstrated his generosity. Among the people and throughout history, rumors arose that the relationship between the two was not limited to diplomacy. Some believed there was a more intimate connection between them, a romance hidden beneath the veils of the official narrative. Although the scriptures record the encounter in political and cultural terms, popular imagination kept alive the idea that from the union of her beauty and his wisdom something more than friendship and respect was born. The presence of the Queen of Sheba in Jerusalem became a symbol of the reach of Solomon's fame. He was no longer just the king of Israel, but the ruler whose glory echoed even to the most distant kingdoms. His court became a destination for ambassadors, merchants, and sovereigns, seeking not only commercial agreements but also the chance to behold the man whose wisdom had no equal. After a few days, the queen returned to her kingdom. Her caravan departed carrying not only gifts but also stories that would be told for generations. Upon returning, she carried with her the memory of Jerusalem, of the temple, of the throne, and above all, of the king who answered riddles as easily as he governed a vast people. The visit forever marked the memory of Solomon's reign. More than a diplomatic transaction, it was a meeting of worlds, a reflection of the glory and universality the king had achieved. The name of Israel, once confined to a small territory, now echoed as a reference among nations, and the image of Solomon became inseparable from that of a sovereign whose fame had reached the ends of the earth. The splendor of Solomon's reign had reached its peak. The temple was built. The palace gleamed with gold and cedar. The king's fame echoed to the ends of the earth, and his harem gathered women from nearly all the surrounding nations. But beneath the surface of this brilliance, cracks began to appear. Absolute power, sustained by political alliances and strategic marriages, carried with it an invisible burden, the complexity of managing not only a kingdom, but also a universe of cultures, languages, customs, and above all, gods. Each foreign wife who crossed the palace gates brought more than her beauty and her dowry. They came accompanied by rooted religious traditions, family rites, sacred songs, and small images of the gods of their lands. Moabite women venerated Chemosh. Ammonites revered Molech. Sidonians burned incense to Astarte. Edomites preserved ancient cults to their tribal idols. Egyptians evoked Isis, Hathor, and Ra. The harem, which to the eyes of the people was a symbol of power and abundance, gradually turned into a cauldron of beliefs that clashed with the faith in the one God of Israel. At first, these rites were discreet. Small improvised altars in the women's chambers, songs chanted in foreign tongues, incense burned in silent nights. But as the number of wives and concubines grew, so too did their influence over the king. Each foreign princess wanted to keep alive the faith of her homeland. And many did so not only in secret, but also in hopes of winning Solomon's approval. The king, in his youth, had shown himself devout and steadfast. He had asked God for wisdom at Gibeon, built the temple in Jerusalem, consecrated sacrifices before the Ark of the Covenant. But the human heart is fertile ground for distractions, and the charm of so many women began to weigh upon his faithfulness. He did not want to deny them their desires. Many times he gave in out of love, affection, or simply political convenience. And so, little by little, strange altars appeared in Jerusalem, erected outside the sacred walls of the temple, dedicated to foreign deities. These cults not only violated the law of Israel, but also provoked internal divisions. Priests and prophets looked with suspicion upon the rumors spreading in the palace corridors. The people, in turn, were astonished to see the king, who was supposed to be the example of devotion to the Lord, allow strange practices to coexist so near the house of God. It was a painful contrast. The same monarch who had built the temple to the Lord, now allowed, even indirectly, other gods to find space in Jerusalem. The complexity of power stood before Solomon in its cruelest form. The matrimonial alliances secured external peace, but generated internal spiritual conflicts. The balance between diplomacy and religious fidelity became ever more delicate. Walking through the palace gardens, the king might hear in one wing Hebrew songs of praise to the one God, and in another, laments and offerings to foreign divinities. The contrast symbolized the duplicity that was beginning to erode Israel's spiritual unity. This situation was also reflected in the king's heart. The man who once asked only for wisdom to govern, who had prostrated himself before the altar crying out for God's presence, now found himself divided. His mind remained sharp and lucid in political and administrative matters, but his heart grew vulnerable to the passions and influences of his vast harem. His closest counselors may have noticed the subtle changes, the king's more frequent absence from religious ceremonies, his tolerance toward foreign cults, his indulgent gaze at his wives' requests. And thus slowly, the spiritual solidity that had sustained the beginning of his reign began to weaken. The people, though not daring to openly contest the king, felt in the air the tension of a new time. Israel, called to be a consecrated nation, began to blend too much with the practices of the surrounding peoples. Foreign altars arose on the hills, strange sacrifices were offered, and the purity of worship to the Lord was diluted amid the multiplicity of deities. The greatness of Solomon stood at a paradox. He had gathered in himself wisdom, wealth, and unmatched fame, but now found himself imprisoned by the very network of alliances that had given him prestige. The abundance of women and gods around him was not only a sign of power, but also of fragility. The greater his court became, the more complex his soul grew. It was in this context that the first criticisms of the prophets arose, reminding that Israel could not serve two masters, nor divide its devotion. But Solomon, absorbed by the magnitude of his own kingdom, allowed himself to be carried away by a divided heart, and thus the beginning of internal and religious conflicts crept like a shadow over the light of his glory. The complexity of power revealed itself in full. The same king who once judged wisely between two women disputing a child, now seemed unable to judge between faithfulness to God and the desire to please the wives who filled his palace. It was the prelude to a spiritual crisis that would deeply mark Israel's future. Time moved forward, and with it grew not only Solomon's glory, but also his vulnerability. The king who had once been a symbol of purity and devotion, who had asked only for wisdom instead of riches, now found himself facing a silent dilemma. The palace was no longer just the house of the king of Israel, but a mosaic of nations, each represented by a wife, each wife bringing with her foreign gods and rituals. And Jerusalem, the city where the temple of the Lord rested, began to fill with contradictions. While the people prostrated themselves in the temple court to worship the one God, other altars arose on the surrounding hills, dedicated to Astarte, Molech, Chemosh, and many other divinities. These altars did not appear suddenly. They were born of small requests, of seemingly innocent concessions made by the king to please his wives. What had once been private tolerance gradually became public worship. Solomon, in his wisdom, understood the gravity of what was happening. He knew the law. He knew the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David. He knew that Israel had been called to be a separate people, different from the nations around them. But his heart was divided between faithfulness to God and the desire to maintain harmony in the palace, between the purity of the covenant and the pleasure of pleasing the women who surrounded him. The king chose indulgence. The man who had built the temple now allowed foreign altars in Jerusalem. The same one who had prayed asking God to hear the people's supplications now accepted that sacrifices be offered to lifeless gods. The heart that once beat with sincere devotion was beginning to fragment. This tension corroded the spirit of the king. He still possessed unmatched riches, still ruled with authority, still was respected by his people and feared by neighboring nations. But within him a void was growing. The external splendor contrasted with the internal loneliness. There were nights when the music, perfumes, and dances of the harem were not enough to fill the silence of his soul. The echoes of this conflict can be felt in the words of the book of Ecclesiastes, attributed to Solomon himself. There shines through the melancholy of a man who, having known all pleasures, concluded that everything is vanity. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, repeats the voice of the weary sage. Wisdom, wealth, banquets, gardens, women, nothing seemed to offer lasting satisfaction. It was like chasing after the wind. The king reflected on the fleetingness of life. He saw men striving for riches and dying unable to take them with them. He observed the righteous and the wicked sharing the same destiny, death. He realized that human labor, however great, always ended in dust. And before all this, the question arose like a painful echo: what, after all, is the meaning of life? These reflections were not mere philosophy, they were the portrait of a divided soul. The man who had possessed everything discovered that without the firm center of faith, nothing had true value. The heart that once bowed only before the God of Israel now found itself trapped between the sacred and the profane, between the eternal and the fleeting. On the hills of Jerusalem, the contrast was visible. On one side, the temple shone with its golden columns, its Levitical songs, its incense smoke rising to heaven. On the other, improvised altars filled with sacrifices to foreign gods, lit by night torches and songs that did not belong to the tradition of Israel. The holy city had become the stage of a dangerous mixture, a direct reflection of the king's divided heart. And so the wisest man on earth faced the simplest and most painful truth. Human wisdom was not enough to preserve the integrity of the soul. The inner emptiness growing in Solomon was the price of his duplicity. He had gained unprecedented wealth and glory but had lost the focus on what truly sustained Israel, faithfulness to the one God. In the silence of his chambers, perhaps the king remembered the dream at Gibeon, when God had asked him what he desired. He recalled the humble request for wisdom and the promise that if he were faithful he would have long life and endless blessings. But now, surrounded by women and foreign gods, he felt the weight of having strayed from that first love. Solomon's divided heart marked not only his own life, but also the destiny of the nation. The seeds of idolatry sown in his days would germinate into future crises, leading Israel to division and downfall. And deep down, the king himself knew it. Thus the man who began his reign by asking for wisdom ended his days reflecting on the vanity of all things. His life became a paradoxical testimony, an example of greatness and a warning of fragility, a sign that even the wisest can lose their way when they allow their heart to be divided. When night fell over Jerusalem, Solomon's palace lit up with dozens of bronze lamps. The golden glow spread through the cedar-paneled corridors and reflected on the silver and gold vessels that decorated the halls. Servants walked silently, lighting torches in the courtyards, while musicians tuned harps and lutes to begin yet another night of celebration. The banquets were grand, designed to impress foreign visitors and reaffirm the king's unmatched wealth. Long tables were covered with embroidered linen cloths, and upon them lay platters filled with roasted lambs, birds seasoned with aromatic herbs, fish brought from the Jordan, and fattened oxen that required days of preparation. Fresh fruits completed the feast, ripe figs, red pomegranates, grape clusters spilling over the dishes, dates dipped in thick honey. Jugs of wine passed from hand to hand, filling goblets adorned with precious stones. The air was saturated with aromas, spices from Arabia, freshly baked bread from the kitchens, incense burning in tall vessels. With each new dish served, the eyes of the guests filled with wonder, as if the banquet were a spectacle not only for the palate, but also for the sight. Musicians positioned in the corners of the hall began soft melodies, first only with harps and flutes, then accompanied by cymbals and drums that marked the rhythm of the dances. Women dressed in translucent veils and gowns embroidered with golden threads entered in ordered lines, moving with grace. Their steps told stories, victories in battles, bountiful harvests, secret loves. The sound of flutes mingled with the tinkling of bracelets, and the whisper of fabrics sliding across the floor. Army officials, tribal princes, and foreign ambassadors occupied places of honor, all fascinated by the splendor of the court. Every gesture of Solomon, seated on his elevated throne, was observed with reverence. The banquet was more than a moment of pleasure. It was a demonstration of power, of abundance, and of Jerusalem's centrality in the known world. And yet, behind all this brilliance, there was a deep solitude. Solomon smiled at the guests. Goblets were raised in his honor, but his gaze often drifted beyond the columns of the hall. The man who possessed hundreds of women, countless servants, and unmatched riches often felt alone. The collective laughter echoed through the high ceiling, but in his heart, the silence was greater. The king watched the dances, the musicians, the generals, the ambassadors, and he perceived the emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. The exotic perfumes, the female voices, the songs, and the most exquisite dishes lost their power before the sensation that all of it was fleeting. The gilded walls did not conceal the restlessness of his soul. At times when the feast reached its height, Solomon would withdraw quietly to a terrace. There he could see the city bathed in moonlight, and hear, in the distance, the song of the Levites still keeping watch at the temple. In those moments, the contrast became clearer. Inside the palace, abundance and excess. Outside, the reminder of the sacred altar, the place of God's presence. The king knew that his life was suspended between these two worlds. One was made of gold, music, and women, the other, of silence and devotion. And the more the nights of banquets succeeded one another, the more evident it became that external greatness was not capable of erasing internal solitude. Thus passed the nights in Solomon's palace, splendid to the eyes of the world, but marked by an emptiness that neither music, nor perfumes, nor dances could fill. An emptiness that grew slowly, like a shadow stretching over the light of dusk. Time, which once seemed an ally, began to exact its price upon Solomon's body and spirit. The years of banquets, alliances, and conquests had passed like wind over the hills of Jerusalem. He who had once reigned with youthful vigor, who had judged with sharpness and governed with inexhaustible energy, now felt the weight of age settle upon his shoulders like a mantle of stone. The palace corridors remained filled with music and perfumes, but the king no longer perceived them with the same delight. His eyes, weary from seeing so many riches, found little brilliance in the golden adornments that covered his halls. The women of the harem, once sources of desire and fascination, had become for him distant faces, memories of passions that had long since faded. The fire of youth had given way to a dim flame, flickering more with nostalgia than with pleasure. The concubines still adorned themselves, still vied for glances, still rehearsed dances, but often the king, seated in silence, seemed not to see. His mind wandered elsewhere, to the days of his youth, when he had asked for wisdom at Gibeon, to the construction of the temple, when the cloud of glory filled Jerusalem, to the moment when the people bowed before the altar united in worship. Memories that rose like monuments in contrast to the fragmented reality of his aging heart. Wisdom which had never abandoned him completely, now came accompanied by a shadow, regret. The king reflected on his choices, on the concessions made throughout the years. He acknowledged that he had allowed foreign altars in Israel, that he had tolerated strange cults in the name of passing passions. He knew he had turned his heart away from the simplicity of the faith inherited from his father David. The weight of each deviation accumulated like stones upon his conscience. Many times, in his old age, Solomon walked slowly to one of the highest terraces of the palace. From there he contemplated the temple he himself had built. He saw its columns raised against the sky, the smoke of sacrifices rising toward the clouds, the songs of the Levites echoing through the city. And then, in silence, he felt the painful contrast between the greatness of the work and the frailty of the man who had built it. The temple remained firm, but his heart, so often divided, had known the instability of human passions. It is in this state that his voice finds echo in the book of Ecclesiastes. Words of a man who had experienced all pleasures and riches, but discovered that none of it filled the emptiness of the soul. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, he wrote. There is revealed not only the sage contemplating life, but also the aged man acknowledging the errors of the past. Wisdom mingles with the weight of regret, forming reflections that sound like a late confession. He speaks of the futility of ceaseless labor, the brevity of youth, the illusion of pleasure, the inevitability of death. The tone is not of despair, but of bitter lucidity. The wisest man on earth discovered, in his old age, that all human glory dissolves like mist before the sun. The only meaning, he concludes, lies in fearing God and keeping his commandments. The servants saw the king quieter, more thoughtful. The counselors found in him less enthusiasm and more prudence. The harem, though still noisy, no longer held the same power over his days. Solomon had grown old not only in body, but also in soul. Passion had given way to memory, abundance to emptiness, glory to reflection. And so Solomon's old age became the mirror of his journey, a mixture of splendor and fragility, of wisdom and regret. He had built the most magnificent temple Israel had ever known, but he had also allowed foreign altars to multiply. He had possessed riches no other king had attained, but discovered he could not purchase them for his soul. He had been surrounded by women and children, yet often felt alone. The man who had begun his life asking for wisdom ended his days reflecting on the brevity of existence. And from his lips the world heard one of the greatest confessions in history, that all under the sun is vanity, and that only in God rests the true meaning of life. Solomon's old age brought not only melancholy reflections and personal regrets. His divided heart left deep marks upon the people he governed. The king who had begun his reign as a symbol of faithfulness to God ended up opening the doors to practices that would corrupt the heart of Israel. His deviation of devotion was not limited to the interior of the palace. It spread like a shadow over the entire nation. The foreign altars erected on hills around Jerusalem were not merely private concessions to his wives. They became places of worship frequented by many. Israelite men and women, fascinated by the exotic rites, began to burn incense and offer sacrifices to gods who had not delivered their fathers from Egypt. Songs to Chemosh, Molech, and Astarte mingled with praise to the Lord, as if Israel's exclusive covenant could be divided among various divinities. This widespread idolatry provoked spiritual confusion. The people, who were supposed to be different from the neighboring nations, began to imitate them. Customs once rejected began to be accepted, and the purity of faith was diluted. The religious unity that had sustained Israel since the days of Moses and Joshua gave way to a diversity of cults that weakened the nation's identity. God, who had revealed himself to Solomon in dreams and blessed him with incomparable wisdom and glory, did not remain silent before this deviation. The message came clearly: because the king had allowed his heart to turn away, the kingdom would be divided. Not in his lifetime, for the sake of David his father, but soon after his death. Thus the promise of unity and prosperity turned into the foretelling of fragmentation. The signs of political fragility were already beginning to appear. Distant tribes complained about the heavy taxes and forced labor required to maintain the splendor of the palace and the temple. Officials of peripheral provinces showed dissatisfaction. External prosperity hid internal tensions that, without the wisdom of the beginning, became more visible. Solomon in his final years may have realized what was about to happen. The man who had built a house for God now saw his people building houses for idols. The king who had once asked for wisdom now watched foolishness spread through Israel. The ruler who had united the tribes under one throne now sensed that they would separate. This foretelling was fulfilled after his death. The united kingdom of Israel, fruit of David's conquests and Solomon's initial wisdom, did not endure. It soon divided into two: the northern kingdom, Israel, with Samaria as its capital, and the southern kingdom, Judah, with Jerusalem as its center. Political and spiritual unity was broken, and the glory of Solomon's reign became a distant memory. Thus the consequences of the king's heart's deviation were not limited to his personal life. They became a collective wound, determining the destiny of an entire nation. The people who had been called to be a light among the nations came to bear the shadows of idolatry, and the kingdom that should have remained firm as a testimony of God's faithfulness was torn apart by human unfaithfulness. The end of Solomon's story is therefore a solemn warning. Wisdom, however great, is not enough when the heart is divided. Riches, however abundant, cannot sustain a nation if devotion is lost. External splendor cannot compensate for internal emptiness. The king's life, marked by unparalleled glory, ends as a reminder: when the heart turns away from God, even the greatest kingdoms can fall. Solomon's life came to an end, wrapped in a paradoxical aura: splendor and regret, wisdom and weakness, greatness and downfall. The man who had begun his journey, asking only for discernment to govern, ended his days carrying the weight of choices that had led his heart astray. His path became both an inspiration and a warning, a living reminder that even the wisest can lose their way when inner discipline is replaced by the seductions of power and pleasure. The king who built the most magnificent temple Israel ever knew, who judged with wisdom that left kings and queens in awe, was also the man who allowed foreign altars to multiply in the promised land. The same one who wrote eternal proverbs, full of clarity and justice, also wrote in his old age words of melancholy in Ecclesiastes, acknowledging the vanity of all things under the sun. This duality shapes the image of Solomon, an extraordinary man, yet still human, capable of approaching the divine and at the same time stumbling over the limits of his own weakness. His legacy is vast. He left behind imposing works, incomparable riches, words of wisdom that endured through generations. But he also left the mark of a divided heart, which opened the way for the division of the kingdom itself. The glory of his name echoed throughout the known world, but his story became a solemn warning. True greatness is not measured by accumulated wealth, sealed alliances, or populated harems, but by the ability to remain faithful and upright before God. In Israel's memory, Solomon remains the wise king, but also the king who lost himself amid his own conquests. His reign is like a mirror of the human condition, full of potential and beauty, yet vulnerable to pride and distraction. He reminds us that wisdom received can turn into vanity if it is not sustained by the discipline of the heart. When his eyes closed to the world, Jerusalem still shone with the gold of the temple and with the feasts of the palace. But within the walls the division to come was already foreseen, and still the man who had known every excess left behind a simple reflection, echoing softly like the evening breeze, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." Thus ends the story of Solomon, with all its light and shadow. A man who reached the height of power and wisdom, but discovered that without inner discipline, even the greatest of kings can be lost. His life remains an eternal lesson. True peace is not found in external abundance, but in the silent faithfulness of the heart. And now, as the narrative rests, the greatness and fragility of the man meet in balance. The sound of banquets and dances fades away, the altars go dark, the temple remains as witness, and silence once again reigns over Jerusalem. The wise king rests, and with him his journey comes to an end. Sleep in peace with this reminder, that even among kings and empires, what sustains life is the simplicity of an upright heart. For all else passes like the wind, but truth remains.